Welcome to Sport at La Trobe, the university of choice for sport. Sport at La Trobe University is for everyone, students, staff, and the broader community. At our Melbourne campus, you can get active at the Sports Centre gym by taking a fitness class or enjoying a leisurely swim. We also have fun programs for kids. You can take part in a range of social sport competitions like basketball, netball and futsal with your friends or colleagues. If you just want to shoot hoops or kick a ball around for fun, come on down to the Melbourne Campus Sports Centre, Sports Park Stadium or Sports Fields. Team La Trobe is our unifying sport banner under which all members of our community can represent the university with pride. This includes large participation events or being a member of one of our 26 affiliated sports clubs. Our students represent Team La Trobe at the highest level of university sport, competing in the Unisport University Nationals. At La Trobe, we recognise that our elite athletes need extra support to juggle their training, competition and study demands. We are a member of the Elite Athlete Friendly University Network and formally provide support through the La Trobe Elite Athlete Program. The university also has exclusive partnerships with professional sporting organisations that deliver a range of student experiences and research outcomes. Sport at La Trobe has something for everyone. To find out more, get in touch with us.
Welcome to this online event today. My name is Professor Russ Hoy, and it's my privilege to serve as Dean of the School of Allied Health, Human Services and Sport at La Trobe University. La Trobe University acknowledges that this event and our participants are located on the lands of many traditional custodians in Australia. We recognise their ongoing connection to the land and value their unique contribution to the university and wider Australian society. We are committed to providing opportunities for Indigenous Australians, both as individuals and communities, through teaching and learning, research and community partnerships across all our campuses and online. We pay our respects to Indigenous elders past, present and emerging, and extend this respect to any Indigenous participants joining us online today. Today's event brings together world-class experts from La Trobe University, Melbourne City Football Club and the global sports industry to explore the big question about how sport is having a positive impact on the community. Sport is often lauded as an effective remedy for solving a wide range of social issues: homelessness, isolation, poverty, and poor access to education or health. Today we'll explore questions such as how sport can continue to be used successfully to tackle social issues and support groups facing disadvantage in the community. What are the key elements that sport organisations and other groups should consider when designing program interventions and using sport to engage with specific groups? And to discuss if sport is having a positive impact on our community, we've brought together an expert panel who will speak to their own experiences on how sport can continue to contribute and impact communities in a meaningful way. Our panel for today includes Craig Foster, former Socceroo and SBS Chief Football Analyst, advocate of social justice through sport and lawyer. Following a celebrated football career, including as Australia's 40th Socceroo captain, Craig became one of the nation's most respected broadcasters with an 18-year multi-Logie winning career at SBS Australia. Craig sits on the Multicultural Council of Australia and works across a range of social programs from Indigenous rights and self-determination, homelessness and domestic violence, along with refugee advocacy. His social justice advocacy extends to several high-profile global campaigns, including leadership of the Safe Hakeem campaign to free Bahraini refugee Hakeem al-Arabi from a Thai prison, calling for the resettlement and freedom of over 400 refugees and asylum seekers indefinitely detained by Australia in PNG and Nauru for almost 7 years, and the humanitarian response by global sport to the COVID-19 pandemic. Also joining us today is Ros Moriarty, a business owner, social investor and author. She is Managing Director and co-founder of Ballaringi and Honorary Managing Director and co-founder of the Moriarty Foundation. The Moriarty Foundation is a not-for-profit initiative established in 2011 that enables Aboriginal families and communities in the Northern Territory, Queensland and New South Wales to unlock the potential for their children. Ros, the independent chair of the FFA Women's Football Council, was named winner of Business Enterprise in the 2015 Financial Review Westpac Australian 100 Women of Influence Awards. She's an inductee of both the Australian Design Institute Hall of Fame and the Australian Businesswomen's Hall of Fame. Ros is also the author of the memoir Listening to Country and shortlisted for both the AIDS 2010 Book of the Year and the Australian Human Rights Commission Literary Award. Also joining us today, George Halkias, Special Community Projects Manager, City in the Community and National Coach of the Big Issue Community Street Soccer Program. George is a pioneer of sport for development in Australia, using football and sport to have a social impact and improve the lives of vulnerable community groups. He is best known for developing the Big Issue Community Street Soccer Program, which uses sport to improve the health and well-being of homeless and disadvantaged people, including asylum seekers and prisoners, and has coached Australian teams at 10 homeless World Cup events. He also works with City in the Community, designing and delivering a range of innovative programs that have social impact, including their specialist youth leadership, walking football, and carers wellbeing programs, which was launched yesterday, I believe, George.
That's correct.
And finally, Dr. Pam Kapoulides, a senior lecturer in sport management at La Trobe University. Her research is focused on volunteer management, sport participation and inclusion of minority groups such as females, core community members and people with disability, community engagement and the impact of sport participation and development in sport, health and recreation. And she specialises in qualitative research methodology and evaluations. So a fantastic panel, lots of expertise. Now to the questions. I might throw firstly to Craig or Foz, as we might refer to you on the panel. What are the different ways in which sport can contribute to the lives of minority groups, such as refugees and displaced young people?
Oh, gee, well, thank you for throwing that question to me first. I'm going to try and answer that, Russ, in as fewer words as possible, because, I'm delighted to be here. Thank you for the invitation. Of course, we all, acknowledge the traditional owners on the land on which we're all currently sitting. I'm, of course, in Sydney with the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. And I'm also sitting on a panel with, amazing people with tremendous knowledge in this area. So what I might say is, from my perspective, there's inside sport and there's outside sport. And I think many athletes and clubs and sporting bodies are focused very much on a programmatic response to the broader social issues. And sport often does a fabulous job of that, whether it's programs for homeless, and you mentioned that before, or around disadvantage and poverty and other elements of inequality. What we don't do so well is then talk about, explore and substantively act on broader social issues outside of sport, i.e., so my real focus at the moment is, all right, what is sport's broader social responsibility then? And homelessness is a really great example. George is an absolute expert here. So there is a profound difference between every sport running brilliant intra-sport programs for homeless people, or high-profile athletes, which is happening now all around the world, raising their voice on homelessness, and sport saying this is just not okay to us as either an institution, a club, or an industry, because we are a socially influential, highly visible and important sector of broader society. And therefore, sport says, oh, well, we just exist here and we don't like to play in all of these politics. Well, homelessness is not politics. Access to housing is a human right. So that's my approach to sports social responsibility, and I think the briefest answer to your question I can give.
All right, I might throw to Ros in a second, but just a quick follow-up, Foz. Do you think it's up to high-profile individual athletes who've taken that message on board, independent of their sports organisations or their clubs? Do you think? Is that the case that you've seen?
That is the case, very largely. I love some of the great work that's being done around the world. For instance, one of the best clubs in Australia is not in the sport that I've spent all my life in, and that's Richmond FC. I think that Brandon Gale and Peggy O'Neill are doing an extraordinary job there. I see them as a really fantastic model for social responsibility. They're actually, well, sadly at the moment, you have to say they're brave enough and courageous enough to engage in these issues. But that's the problem with sport. It's like, why should it be? Why should it require any type of bravery to speak up on behalf of vulnerable people who desperately need the help of all of us? It's just that I happen to believe sport does not exist external to society. It just has a responsibility. The issue with athlete advocacy, which of course I'm a big supporter of, is simply this, that athletes have historically and are still having to carry the load for broader sport. And therefore, quite often, that load means the cessation of their career. So look at Colin Kaepernick. So Colin Kaepernick's talking about a basic human rights and civil rights, but human rights issue of racial equality. Really simple. No one should have any argument with it. Yes, political parties might want to deal with that differently, but this is a basic human right. And yet he's lost his career from doing what I believe, and he certainly believes, that sport should be doing on his behalf.
And we might come back to that question about the interplay between athletes as employees of sport and their limitations they might face in the industry. But we might just go straight to Roz. And Roz, from your experience, you're running a foundation, you've been involved in this space for a while. What are the different ways that you've seen sport act as a positive vehicle for change?
So reflecting Craig's comments, we're all working from home and on various parts of country. I'm sitting here on Camaragal country and acknowledge elders past, present and emerging, and I sit within a household of Yanyuwa people from my family from the Gulf Carpenter area, and acknowledge Craig as a long time, in fact, inaugural board member of our foundation, Moriarty Foundation. My hats, I guess, I wear in this space are both Indigenous football. We established John Moriarty Football back in 2011, reflecting John as the first Indigenous player to be selected for Australia, and acknowledging that not too much happened since, and also the Women's Football Council. And, although some commentators, I guess, refer to women as bringing diversity, to me, it's got nothing to do with diversity. It's about equality. And, the Women's Football Council is very focused on, I guess, creating the environment where the sorts of platforms that Craig's describing and the kind of influence we can all have in society to us, it's a lot about the environment. And I guess with John Moriarty Football, what we've tried to do is create a structure and an environment and a source of expertise where all those benefits, all those social benefits that can address homelessness and incarceration and poor health and poor education, we're looking to bring the Indigenous community to the table, to bring them inside the design of these programs. And to me, that's the biggest issue, both with women and with the Indigenous community, is that seat at the table hasn't been on offer. So until the community itself is brought to the table, I think our efforts to, if you like, address social issues, as well as acknowledge assets and the value that the communities bring, regardless of that disadvantage, what they actually inherently bring, we need to bring the community in as much as the athletes in the community we're finding.
Thanks, Roz. We might throw straight to George, and if you could give an example of a recent, you've run a multitude of programs, but what have you seen that's been the different ways you managed to affect change in the community through some of those programs?
Yeah, Russ, I think it's interesting that we talk about sport as a homogeneous sector where, essentially we're all trying to do similar things to try and create better people, better community, stronger community, and improve one's health and well-being. But we're all doing it in different ways, and there's probably different areas of the sector, and I think it's important to define those. So the area that I work predominantly in is what you describe sport for development or sport development. And so we're using sport as a tool for engagement, but adding other developmental tools, community development, to try and address the key issues that you mentioned earlier. And so obviously with the big issue, 20 odd years, I've been trying to use the power of football to address homelessness, mental illness, disability, incarceration, substance abuse and the like. And so it's a very distinct sector, and we've learnt over the years that participation is a great tool of engagement, but adding the things such as the mentoring and the education and the health promotion and all those other aspects that we can add can have an even greater impact on the individuals that we're sort of trying to work with. So I think that's a key aspect for me. At City in the football, we work a lot in the sport development phase, where we're trying to work on individuals who we know are lacking in physical activity and at risk, both in their mental health and physical health. And just in the recent years, we've done the walking football where, you know, the seniors area wasn't seen as sexy enough or wasn't seen a key area, but we know that social isolation and physical inactivity is a key risk factor for older people. And we introduced the walking football program that's now become national. Similarly, in recent times, Pam and I worked on the Called Carers program, and this is Carers Week. And we know that carers are those special people offering support and care to loved ones with disability, mental illness and chronic age conditions. And so that's a group that's never been tapped into, and they have so many barriers to physical activity. And proud to say that with the support of Vic Health, we're now running a program that can give them the benefits of exercise and wellbeing. So for me, the change can happen in different ways. And Foz has spoken about the great work that athletes are now coming to the fore and helping us to, you know, to draw attention to these issues. But there's also others who are working in this space at a more programmatic grassroots level that are trying to use the skills that they have both in sport and community development to have an impact. And for me, it's a growing and emerging sector. And it's probably, I guess, notable too that the United Nations now has added sport in the Sustainable Development Goals and their 2030 targets. So all of a sudden, sport itself is getting that validation, that credibility. And I think we've come a long way. So very pleased to have been in this sector, but seen it grow exponentially in the last 20 years. And I suspect the next 10 years are going to be pretty fast and furious too.
All right, thanks, George. I want to quickly throw to Pam Kapoulides and just ask you, in terms of the evidence base that's building around, you know, sport as an effective vehicle, has that changed recently in the last 5 or 10 years about the evidence of sport being effective at what it's been asked to do and choosing to do?
Yeah, I think over the last probably 5 years, I've seen a lot more programs starting to think about what are the outcomes of what they're delivering. So we always knew there were outcomes. We always knew that sport had a vehicle to make some of these changes or support people in some of the things that the panel has already discussed. But what we haven't done really well is actually articulate, you know, what are we doing, where are we going, and what are the impacts that we're having on individuals. We've talked about health benefits, we've talked about mental health benefits as well, but I think it goes beyond that. I think it goes beyond, you know, the community being impacted as well, particularly if you're talking about perhaps refugee communities. And Foz talked a little bit about this, where, you know, they come to a new place and sport might be a way that they start to connect with Australian community or Australian culture. And we haven't done a lot in sport around that, where we've really looked at what impact is that having on people. And even with our Indigenous community, I know, you know, I'm doing some work at the moment where it's not necessarily called sport, but it's the ballet going and running education programs in remote communities with Indigenous people and using dance, which to, you know, Indigenous communities, dance is a very strong cultural connection that they have to their culture. And by using dance, they've been able to make some huge impact on them actually then getting into other programs and getting other supports. And I think it follows up with what George said as well, that, you know, thinking about sport being a vehicle, but also what else does it do for people, I think is really important to think about.
Oh, thank you. And back to you, Foz. Just, you clearly use sport as a platform and your own individual profile to raise awareness of particular issues. And you mentioned in your opening remarks that you've got this within sport and out of sport sort of dichotomy, if you like, about how effective sport groups are. When looking at sport itself, it's being funded now by groups like Vic Health, as George mentioned, and being asked to deliver things which are non-sport related. So this using sport as the flypaper, if you like, or the connection between people to deliver an outcome for a community group. What are the things you've seen in sport which are preventing those groups being even more proactive in seeking to do that? Is it their capacity, their challenges, their understanding, or their motivation to get involved in community causes?
I think it's all of the above, but it depends how you frame what is a community cause. And So what sport does really well, and my focus is more, mostly on the global level, the global major sporting bodies, FIFA, IOC, and others. And so the concept of Olympism, or the fact that FIFA says that it's for the game and for the world, the fact that we've got a human rights policy within FIFA now, and yet the reticence of the game to live up to that policy is profound. And to your question, one of the reasons is because so many of those rights that we've agreed as a community of nations people should have, which feeds right down in the community where George and Ros and everyone is working, become politicised. And therefore sport finds that barrier, finds that line where it says, well, we're a little bit uncomfortable over here. It's the reason why I think, and so sport approaches social issues in a really subjective manner. Take, for instance, what happened with Cathy Freeman, I think is a really great historic example. 94, she carries 2 flags. It's her human right to do so, okay? But at that time, the country is not quite ready for it, for whatever reason. And she's then ostracised and attacked by her own sport, or her own sporting organisation, the Commonwealth Games. Subsequent to that, I think it was when Keating ratified the Aboriginal flag as a national flag. And in 2000, she famously not only carried it, but, participated in the opening ceremony and all these things. Now, the fact of the matter is that came down to the judgment of John Coates, who was, the head of the AOC. Like, he decided at that time that was a good idea. And I don't think that process is a good idea. I think that if Cathy Freeman or Adam Goodes have a human right to express their culture, that's what sport should be beholden to, rather than whether James Johnson or Gillan McLaughlin or Gianni Infantino or Fatma Samura or any of the other sport administrators or governors feel safe enough, comfortable enough, or passionate enough about an issue to actually be able to speak out or do something. So this whole subjective nature that sport has produced for itself is really, we all know, is farcical. I mean, take a look at the Olympic movement. So the Olympic movement have got issues now on Belarus, where the president also appoints himself president of the National Olympic, tries to say we're not political. Of course, it's deeply political. So let's just put that aside for a moment and all accept that sport is a part of life and is political. We'll try and get on one of the boards of one of the national governing bodies and tell me that it's not political. So therefore, let's just admit that in sport now. This is, I think, the next phase for sport. Just say, look, we're actually part of society here. And when people say, well, I don't want an athlete speaking up on a political issue, we say, well, why is refugees and asylum seekers political? They have human rights under international law. So that's the bridge, in my view, to create a really safe space. It's a safe space for Adam Goodes. It's a safe space for AFL to protect every person, including him and every other Indigenous or whichever athlete. And it's a safe space for athletes. That's why I think that part of the education has been missing and is really important for sport.
Yeah, and I think some of the work you're doing is clearly bringing sports awareness along to have that willingness to be part of the, central to that debate rather than just being on the sideline, to use a sporting metaphor. Ros, your foundation deliberately uses sport as a vehicle. Why do you think sport is particularly effective in the context of the work of your foundation?
So sport, I guess, as you say, brings a lot of the vernacular to the Australian language. So things like levelling the playing field. It's clearly about sport. It's about, optimising a playing environment, but it's also about what happens in corporations, what happens in societies who are looking to integrate their members in, useful and supported lives. So sport is central, and for us, football became central because, as I mentioned, John was the first Aboriginal player selected for Australia, and nothing much had happened since. So to us, the other codes had done very well. So AFL, NRL, they'd really attracted players to the sport. quite visibly and with good support, but football had never done that. And so I think the early days when we were talking about this, and it was really about developing a football program to redress that gap, but it became so much more. And very early on, it became a program about well-being and social equity and actually gender equality. We have 50-50 male-female coaches. We've worked very, very hard at that. We have 50-50 boy-girls, unlike, I guess, the codes that have been more successful with Indigenous players in the past. But if you look at our expansion over the last 12 months, we were delivering to about 120 kids in the Gulf of Carpentaria for our 8-year pilot. And, I love what Pam is saying about measurement and impact. It's critical to actually support these initiatives. We really need to know, basically, we're not doing harm. Secondly, what is the impact, and, how well are we doing to change, to create points of change? So going from there over the last 12 months to 120 kids in a couple of locations in the territory to 1,200 plus kids in 3 states, with 29 coaches, 19 of whom are Indigenous, 50-50 male-female, unlocking 18 schools in those regions within curriculum. Yes, it's about football, yes, it's about sport, but it's actually about social cohesion and community involvement, and we're regional and we're remote. So, these are really where there's deep disadvantage. There are deep blockages, wide blockages to participation in society. And I think picking up from last year's Women's World Cup, the thing that Fatma Samora actually said at the convention there that really struck home with me, and it stayed with me in my work also for the Women's Council, is that women's football is not just about women in football, it's about women in society. And I think we could, taking Craig's lead, we could apply that to anyone who engages in any form of sport, which is most of us actually at some level, that it is about our role in society and it is about our responsibility. And I think those of us who have the opportunity and the charter to really create systemic change that can support these points of change, I think we have a responsibility to do that. And that's really what our foundation is about, is creating points of change from community out, so from community up.
I'm sure over the last decade, as you've moved from, as you said at the start, you initially started on putting a sport program together, and then it's evolved into all these other things that, you've got employment outcomes for individuals, you've got social cohesion outcomes. What have you learned as sort of if you had to give one takeaway to the audience today about what has worked really well in your foundation to make that broader impact outside of just running the sport bit effectively? What would you say would be the key there?
I think it's in our mission statement, which is to enable families and communities in remote and regional Aboriginal Australia to unlock their own children's potential. Probably goes back, Russ, to the comment I made at the start, which is to bring communities to the table in decision-making roles is critical, it's key. I don't think it can work without it. So I think it's the community ground up, local employment, as you mentioned, but really looking at the world through another's vision, putting yourself truly in someone else's shoes, working out what sport can achieve given, where a community might want to go, where the individuals from that community might want to go, regardless of how you define that community. To us, it is decision-making in the hands of that community. We're really a support. Sydney office and our terrific team and our board are really in support of local people to come to the table, in our case, through football in early years, but in this case, particularly through football.
I think they're really good points, because if we were having this conversation a decade ago, you could probably point to a lot of sports organisations as sort of landing into a community with a predetermined program and just saying, we're here to help, and then disappearing 6 months later and nothing's really changed. So I'd just like to throw now to George and just ask you about your particularly your carers program, in terms of what was the impetus to actually create that, and how did you work out there's an evidence base that this is required? Where did that come from?
Look, it's an interesting project in itself, and something different probably for City in the community and probably sport as such to identify a target group like carers. But it goes back to the discussions that I usually have with Pam over a chamomile or a coffee on a Friday afternoon, to just sort of talking all things sport and impact, and looking at different groups that might have a huge need, and both of us have experience in the caring area. And it was an area that, a group of people that face so many challenges and barriers, particularly to physical activity. Their commitment and, the effort that they put to their loved ones just does not allow them really to engage in sport and the like. So for us to target a group and identify also that Vic Health have got their innovation grants, which sort of are looking at these target groups and marry that up. And I think it highlights the importance of collaboration between community organisations, foundations and academia. So quite often I've probably worked in the past at the back end of programs where academia come and do our valuations and come and do our monitoring. And that's been really useful. But in this case with Pam, just being able to co-design, talk through her experience in working in disability and carers, and it sort of drove that idea. And some would say, what would a football club be doing working with carers? And we know that carers are generally 70% are female, who themselves face barriers to participation in exercise and sport. And for us to design an activity that just wasn't about football, but it was a low-level, non-threatening physical activity that carers from diverse cultural backgrounds could also participate in. And I think it was unique that we were able to drive those ideas together and brainstorm it and take it from something embryonic to last week launching the website, or a couple of days ago launching that website. So for me, lots of lessons there, and also about the collaboration, not just between academia and organisations like Football Club, but we have ADEC, which is a particular organisation that works in disability and ethnic communities, Carers Victoria. So you're bringing into line a whole range of organisations and groups that would never get involved in sport and seeing the difference. And I think there's a great future for us to broaden who's working in this space. So historically, it's been sports and associations, sports clubs, but now you're starting to see local government, you're starting to see charities such as The Big Issue and further not-for-profit organisations. So I like to think that in future, this is a demonstration that we can see the impact, we're validating it, we're more sophisticated in the design, and hopefully we can get other organisations with expertise in a whole range of areas participate in these sort of programs.
I think they're really important points, George, because as Ros mentioned, it's about bringing the community along for the journey and listening to them and designing an intervention or a program and having their needs in mind rather than the sports needs. And Craig's comments at the start about, sport needs to cover that bridge between thinking about what sport does and working with all these other range of organisations that are in the community. And that's maybe an inherent barrier to sport, that they're not skilled up, haven't got the capacity, the awareness, the understanding. So I still think there's a long road to go for sports to get much more.
Definitely, Russ. If I can just talk about Melbourne City's Young Leader program, which I think is a perfect example of, we know that particularly in our refugee migrant communities, a passion for the game, of the round ball. But they're also passionate about their community. They're passionate about social inclusion. They're passionate about interacting and resettling in their newfound country. And so they want to use football to make a difference. And so Melbourne City and City in the Community have been implementing this youth leadership program, which usually happens throughout the year. There's connection to Manchester City, but it's upskilling, motivating, and seeing the young people as the drivers of the change and the designers of these programs. So they themselves are skilled, as I said, in so many different ways, from coaching to designing to mentoring, and they get down and dirty in their own communities, many in the public housing estates, working with those new arrivals. And they're the ones that are achieving that change themselves. So again, going back to what we said, sometimes we can sit in our offices and our ivory towers and design a model that we think will fit particular target groups, but there's nothing like getting the individuals themselves just drive it and use their own expertise. So I think that's one of the successes of the City and the Community program, is their flagship youth leadership program.
Thanks, George. Just a quick question to Pam. You've worked with very specific minority groups. What have been some of the lessons you've learned about dealing with particular minority groups and their understanding or engagement with sport might have been really limited in the past? What have you learned from those experiences you've had?
Yeah, thanks, Russ. I think what I've learned is that sometimes sport doesn't speak the same language to every group. So it might be that, like I've worked with called communities quite a bit, and migrant and refugee communities, and what we see as sport, they might not see as sport. So that's been really important for me to really, it's interesting to what George was saying about this co-design. actually finding out what does sport mean to them, because sport might mean that they go for a walk with their friends and have a chat. That, you know, community sport in a lot of cultures is not something that they're used to from their hometowns or from other cultures. So for us in Australia, we see sport being part of a club or being part of a sport code, but not necessarily all groups have that understanding or that wants. So for me, I think thinking about working with others, when working with minority groups, thinking about what does sport mean to them, because it might be very different to what you and I think about it in Australian community. And I think interestingly, on the points of what have already been raised, you know, that avoiding the short-term fix of ticking a box because we want to engage with a group to do sport, but really, can they, you know, can we actually offer them something else? Like I mentioned earlier, dance or walking. I mean, the Walking for Football program has been so successful for called communities because of that reason, because it speaks to what they want to be engaged in. You know, they might not necessarily want to come and join a club, but they still want to be physically active. So I hope that sort of answers your question.
It does. Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. All right. I think we've got time for one last question, which is a real good one. Danilo has asked, are we asking too much from coaches? Sounds like we're asking them to be coaches, mentors, health experts, experts in social services, essentially be anything that the participants want, keeping in mind that many coaches are not social workers and in many instances are either volunteers or not paid very much. So is this an inherent assumption you think is held by coaches in the sporting community, or is this very much not what we're asking of these people?
Well, I might take that one. Thanks, Danilo. Look, I come to this sector with a background in psychology, and to this day, 20 odd years later, I'm still learning about the skills that you need to, you know, to coach and to work in, whether it's working with vulnerable groups in broader sport. There's an expectation that you need to obviously be an instructor in the sport, a facilitator, a mentor, reactor, whole different groups. Some of those people might have experienced trauma, different age groups, different genders. There's so many different skills that you need to have to deliver a program that has an impact. And so the question lies whether people have that capacity, whether they do have those skills, and where is that training coming from? So at City in the Community, obviously there's a lot of upskilling through their leadership program and the Big Issue Community Street Soccer program. That's part of my role, is to try and share my knowledge and expertise, but it's still an embryonic area and an embryonic sector. And so people come to coaching, whether in community, from a whole range of backgrounds. Some of the best coaches I've met have been, you know, painters and tradies, but they've got that passion and commitment for people and their love of sport, and they want to see, you know, people, you know, improving their lives through sports. So for mine, there's a huge role for us to work with coaches and try and build them and grow them and build their capacity. So, you know, some of the trauma-informed coaching is probably an area. We talk about coaching asylum seekers and refugees, but we need to understand what, you know, what are the impacts on them and what are the things that we can help them improve understanding where they're coming from. So for me, this is a perennial issue, and another issue that comes down to funding as well, because usually when we're designing a program and looking at the budgets, it's, you know, 70% coordination, 20% events, and 10% the actual coaching. We might pay a coach the smallest amount to do probably the biggest job. And you can have the best program in the world, and if you don't have the coach or facilitator to deliver it, you just don't get the impact. So that's where the investment lies in a sport for development program, to my mind.
I think also, Russ, it plays, sorry.
Go on, Ross.
Sorry, I was going to say it quickly. I think it also plays into something that's key for us on Women's Council, and that is we know that worldwide there are 30 million women in organised participation. There are 300,000 women and girls in Australia, and we've got 11,000 in the Indigenous and called communities, which and that's doubled since 2018. But we also know that the lack of professional resourcing within women's football, or within football in general for women, means that the structure doesn't necessarily provide the kind of support networks you're talking about. And we know that girls will typically drop out of football, for instance, after a couple of years. And that can be because the club environment or the association or wherever they're playing doesn't necessarily know how to welcome girls or how to look after them once they're there. So it is about structure and about investing in the game and in sport for marginalised groups. And, so far women are still marginalised within football. Regardless of, the fabulous work our Matildas are doing. We've just sent an embarrassment of riches to all those clubs in England. But the reality is that here on the ground in Australia, football is still not a very welcoming place for girls and women. So I think addressing the professionalism of sport and how we do put all those support structures in place, and how we do look after pastoral care and psychological support and mental health, and practical things around girls and women in sport or from any group of disadvantage, then we really need to get serious about resourcing it properly.
Yeah, thanks, Ros. I'm just conscious of the time that we need to wrap up pretty quickly. So I'd just like to thank our terrific panel for their contributions today, but also for their broader contributions to our communities. Craig Foster, Ros Moriarty, George Halkias and Pam Capilides. Thanks also to Andrew Pettigrew from Trobe Sport for his stellar event management skills. And thanks to all of you who've registered and participated in today's event. Your donations that will be doubled by the City Football Group will go directly towards supporting the Cityzens Giving for Recovery programs in Melbourne that support a range of disadvantaged groups in this city. So good afternoon, and we'll leave you with a short video of the Cityzens Giving for Recovery program. Thank you very much.
All around the world, together, we have been facing a health emergency. Heroes have risen to challenges they had never imagined. Many have suffered enormous loss.
Now it's time to help our communities get back on their feet.
Now is the time for City Football Group, our 9 clubs, thousands of staff and millions of fans to make a difference, giving our time, giving our expertise, giving our resources, and giving our voice.
Now is the time to come back together for recovery. Today, we can look forward and make a positive difference.
Citizens Giving for Recovery. Get involved. Donate now.